Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, good evening to those who are following us from Asia. I'm very pleased to launch this panel. That is our last panel in this conference, but also a very important and innovative one. It is about suburbs and migration, suburbs of large cities. As you know, I'm an entrepreneur. You've been seeing me a bit too much these last days. I would like first to start with a land acknowledgement for the session and for our entire conference. We're joining you here today from Toronto, which is the district of the One territory. It is the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississauga indigenous peoples. I very much like, I have to say, the message of the dish with one spoon, because the dish is our natural landscape, our natural resources, and the spoon is what we humans do, how we use, but also take care of these resources. We're all invited by the traditional people of this land to join in peace and share these resources. And as I said, take care of them. And I think this is a very important message. I want to acknowledge my position as a guest and as a settler that came to this land uninvited. And I'm also still thinking about it, learning about this, and trying to understand what are my responsibilities and what I should do in addressing the injustices that have been made in the past. I want in this occasion also to remind ourselves that Ryerson University is in the process of renaming itself. Egerton Ryerson was, among other things, the architect of the residential schools. For those who don't know, the residential schools were schools where Indigenous kids were taken forcibly from their families and put into these schools where they faced abuse and neglect. We have had some terrible discoveries that we, of course, suspected for decades. But these latest discoveries happened in spring 2021 of unmarked graves around past residential schools. And that was really, I think, a big push for the university that had been already considering for over 4 or 5 years now, this question of the name. So it was the final push for the university really to decide to change the name. And we're in this process and we hope it's going to be completed by end of the spring. So soon you will know us with another name. And with this acknowledgement of our positionality, I'd like to start this last session that for me is very, very innovative and very interesting, because I have come to learn about the importance of suburbs through my colleague, Dr. Zhuang, who is also the chair and organizer and convener of this session. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Zhixi, who will introduce our panel.
Thank you, Anna. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are located in the world. I'm honored to chair this panel discussion with the 3 wonderful panelists and an international audience. Today's topic is about suburban migration, interrogating the intersections of global migration and suburban transformation. Specifically, the panel will draw on migration-related suburbanization in the US, China, and Canada to cast light upon the narratives of everyday suburban life, diversity management, growth and development, policy and governance, and social-spatial inequity and injustice. Suburbanization has become a global phenomenon with multifaceted patterns of change in various contexts. Migrant settlement in the suburbs is not new, but adds complexity to suburbia by bringing diverse demographics, different cultural practices, new build forms, and new meanings of space and community. Migrant suburbs often challenge the conventional organization of land, space, service, and infrastructure. How do we reconcile competing claims for space and rights to the city? What are the considerations of equity inclusion in the migrant-related suburbanization processes? What are the policy implications to create more welcoming and inclusive communities in the suburbs? How can we learn from various perspectives from different contexts? We will soon delve into these questions. I'd like to first welcome our panelists. Our first speaker, Dr. Cathy Yang Liu, is professor and chair in the Department of Public Management and Policy at the Andrew Yang School of Policy Studies, Georgia State University, where she directs and teaches in the Planning and Economic Development concentration. She conducts research and publishes widely in the areas of community and economic development, urban labor markets and inequality, and migration and entrepreneurship, as well as international urban development. Her edited book, Immigrant Entrepreneurship in Cities, Global Perspectives, was just published by Springer in 2021. Cathy currently serves as a senior associate editor for the Journal for Urban Affairs, an associate editor for Economic Development Quarterly, and an associate editor for Regional Studies, Regional Science. She's going to talk about suburbanization and migrant entrepreneurship in the US. Our second speaker, Dr. Jie Shen, is associate professor in the School of Social Development and Public Policy, Fudan University in Shanghai. She received her PhD in City and Regional Planning at Cardiff University and worked as a visiting scholar in the Department of Geography, University College London. Her research focuses on urban and regional development in China, including suburbanization, suburban development, mega-urban projects, and social-spatial differentiation. She has published papers in high-impact journals such as Antipode, Environment and Planning A, Urban Geography, Regional Studies, Cities, and Land Use Policy. She currently serves as an editor of Regional Studies and a corresponding editor of the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. She will talk about social-spatial exclusion of immigrants in Shanghai. Last but not least, our third speaker, Dr. Carlos Teixeira, is professor in the Department of Community Culture and Global Studies, University of British Columbia. His current research focuses on the changing social geography of Canadian cities, ethnic entrepreneurship, through comparative case studies of immigrants in Toronto and Vancouver, and the housing experiences and coping strategies of new immigrants and refugees in suburban Toronto and Vancouver. He has published in journals such as Urban Studies, Urban Geography, Environment and Planning C, the Canadian Geographer Journal of Housing and the Built Environment, and Housing Studies, and has co-edited 3 books, The Housing and Economic Experiences of Immigrants in US and Canadian Cities by the University of Toronto Press in 2015, Immigrant Geographies of North American Cities by Oxford University Press in 2012, The Portuguese in Canada, The Diasporic Challenges and Adjustment, second edition by the University of Toronto Press in 2009. He was also the Housing and Neighborhoods domain leader for Metropolis, British Columbia, and the priority leader for the Housing and Neighborhoods Research Domain of the Metropolis Project, a federally funded Canada-wide consortium of academics, government partners, and community organizations. He's going to talk about housing new Canadians on the edge of the suburbs in Vancouver. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to our first speaker. Cathy, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Zhixi. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Hello from Atlanta, Georgia, United States. It's really great to see an international audience here around this very interesting topic. And thanks to the organizers for organizing such an important forum for us to have this opportunity. Let me share screen real quick. Okay, great. So today I would like to share with you some work around the topic of the suburbanization of migrant and minority-owned businesses in the US. Before I zoom in to the US context, I would like to first talk about this book that Zhixi just mentioned. This is the book that is really along, kind of quite aligned with the topic and with kind of the idea of this conference, which is comparative and kind of a global perspective on immigrant entrepreneurship in cities. I attended some of the sessions yesterday and also the day before. I think there is a general understanding that some of this kind of a dialogue has been mainly focused on the Western countries. And so the idea of this book that I edited collected from case studies from around the world. As you can see on this map here, many different cities in different parts of the world are actually represented. I paid a particular attention to cities that actually do have migration flow, important kind of dynamics in their cities, but have not been discussed sufficiently in the literature yet. But however, as you can also see, that there are continents and there are countries and cities that are very important, but are not covered. So I hope that this will just be a beginning of kind of more work around this topic, that we can generate more case studies, can generate more kind of discussion and dialogue around this country as we start to get more case studies and start to get more inquiries into this topic. So in today's presentation, I would like to talk particularly about the US case. And we know that in the US, we've been talking about the suburbanization of the minority and immigrant population in recent decades for some time. And also, we understand that minority-owned businesses and migrant entrepreneurship had very substantial growth in the past years and play increasingly important role in the economy, especially around COVID-19. We hear lots of anecdotal stories about how these businesses have been, even though they have been very hard hit by the pandemic, they have also been quite resilient, or many of them have been very resilient in enduring through the pandemic, adjusting their business strategies, and really kind of play very important roles in the business recovery and serving the markets in the current world. However, the motivation for this research is that we don't know much as we know about the population trends, and we have quite some research on the population trends in the suburban areas. We don't know as much kind of on a general scale of what is the suburbanization trends of these businesses. Are these businesses also suburbanizing along with their respective population to those areas, or are they still kind of more concentrated in the central city areas? And I know this is certainly a case-by-case basis, right? Each city would have different dynamics, but what we're trying to do here is really to understand, if we look at many different metropolitan statistical areas, or I'll call MSAs, for the rest of the presentation, what kind of general trend can we see, right? And what kind of different contexts plus to explain and understand those dynamics that we see, either showing us one way or the other. So this is actually a piece that's forthcoming in this journal that's co-authored with a former student of mine, and called Minority-Owned Businesses Moving to Suburbs, Intrametropolitan Spatial Shift and Their Courses. So in addition to looking at their spatial kind of patterns, we're also interested in the relative presence, performance, and growth of these firms in the central city versus the suburban communities. We'll go through some kind of general background of this research. I know there are certainly experts in the audience, but there could be people who's less familiar with this research. The suburbanization of employment population is widely discussed for reasons that, for example, businesses want to move to suburbs in pursuit of cheaper land cost, also to be closer to workers, right, and closer to clients, whereas the residents have been suburbanizing in the US for some time based on their preference for bigger houses, maybe preferences for different kind of amenities. We know for the minority-owned businesses, they have a traditional attachment to the central cities. And this is a long-lasting literature looking at various different ethnic communities from Chinatown to Little Italy, where these ethnic minorities and immigrants find their way into the central city neighborhoods, and to draw from their co-ethnic workers, draw from the markets there, draw from the co-ethnic clients. And so they really carve out these what we call ethnic enclaves in these central city communities. But increasingly, we hear about the suburbanization of the minority and immigrant populations, and also of the businesses themselves. And we have some very very interesting case studies. I mean, the first one, the Hardwick piece, this is really about the population suburbanization, where she called, now we have a melting pot suburbs. So we no longer have this kind of a dichotomy of a diverse central city versus a white suburban area, but we really see the suburbanization of diversity as well. And we also have the interesting case by Dr. Li on ethnoburbs in Los Angeles, and also by Dr. Zhuang on Toronto, the very interesting case of Globurbia. I mean, all these different terms capture this phenomenon of that we do have increasingly diverse suburban areas as well. Many of these work are single case studies, with some exceptions, some interesting recent exceptions. We don't know kind of on a more general scale, what's the pattern of business suburbanization for a wide section of US metropolitan areas. And that is kind of the idea that we have in this research. We used this data set called Survey of Business Owners. This is a census data set that has quite detailed data on the demographic characteristics of the business owners. Okay, so we don't have kind of many good data sets for researchers interested in minority-owned and immigrant-owned businesses in the US. Sometimes we need to rely on the population census and use self-employment as a proxy for businesses. But this is one source where it is about businesses, but also provide detailed information on the owner characteristics. So we're able to use it to identify the minority-owned businesses. So this particular data set, for some years, we have the micro data available, meaning we can really look at the detailed information, but for other years, we only have aggregate data available. And for the business characteristics, it has in the information, for example, the number of employees, it has number of firms, sales and receipts, and total annual payroll. So these are kind of the main indicators we'll be looking at in this research, and also make distinction between all the firms. And we all know that many of these firms are actually one-person businesses, and employer firms, which are the firms that has at least one employee. We selected a sample of 60 MSAs that represent actually over half of all the national businesses in the US. And our broad dichotomy is a fairly broad proxy between the central counties and suburban counties, as we look at the county that contains the central city as the central county central city area, and the rest of the MSA as suburban counties. We used some descriptive analysis as well as regression analysis, in the regression analysis, we really model a number of demographic, economic structure, and policy environment variables on the growth of central county share of MSA firms. So as a way to kind of see the relative, is that centralization or suburbanization of these firms over time. Am I doing okay on time? I can't really see the time here.
You have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I don't know, given everyone's time zone, people in the appetite for a lot of data at this time of the day, but I'll just quickly share some data slides so that we can get a sense of what is going on here. First, I want to share with you the share and growth of businesses between 2007 and 2012 to see the scale of things for these businesses. And as you can see, I break it down by all firms and employer firms. And in each of the case, the share really shows the share of the type of businesses in all the businesses. So for example, in this case, Black-owned businesses make up 9.9% of all businesses in 2007, and that share increased to 12.5% in 2012. So we can see that all the minority, and this is Asian-owned businesses on the second line, and then Hispanic-owned businesses from 9.7 to 13.5%, white-owned businesses as a comparison, and all of them. So as you can see, we do see that minority-owned businesses make up increasing shares of all businesses in the US over time. I also want to mention that this is a time where we actually have the Great Recession in history in the US economy. So the Great Recession was from 2007 to 2009. So you can see that in general, if we compare this time period to the before and after, the general business growth is actually slower than kind of the before and after time periods. And also, but if we look at the employer firms, we see a somewhat different story, that if we look at the employer firms for each of these minority-owned businesses, that their shares are actually a lot lower than their shares of all businesses, meaning that many of these businesses are actually one person, very small operations, rather than these employer firms that's actually hiring workers. So if we really look at the total of all these minority-owned businesses, they only make up about 13% of the employer businesses. So in other words, kind of in the larger scale businesses for these firms, this actually lagging behind their general trend. And here, I would like to show you kind of the trend of the share of the businesses in the central counties. The y-axis is 2007 and the x-axis is 2012. And for each of these four graphs, we have the first one, all businesses, and then we have the second one, Black-owned businesses, and then Asian-owned businesses, and Hispanic-owned businesses. You may not be able to see a lot of details from this graph, but what you can probably see is that at least for the all businesses, you see that, and this is the percentage businesses in the central county, right? That you can see that they're heavier in 2007 than in 2012, meaning that between 2007 to 2012, it's a generally suburbanization kind of a trend or decentralization trend. But the opposite is true for the other graphs, that they are heavier actually in the central cities in 2012 as compared to 2007, meaning that they actually become more centralized or becoming more concentrated in the central counties as compared to the suburban areas. So when we look at the numbers, the Black and Asian-owned businesses are more centralized in these central counties in 50 of the MSAs, and also the Hispanic-owned businesses are more centralized in 35 of these MSAs, meaning that, yes, we do see some suburbanizing trend, but these businesses remain a very stable kind of force in the economic landscape of the central cities. We did the performance indicators for all the three indicators, as I mentioned to you at the beginning of the presentation, but in particular, I want to share with you one of them. This is the sales and receipts, average sales and receipts in $1,000. And also I'm sharing with you the percentage of the sales and receipts generated by each type of businesses in the central cities and in the suburbs. Without going into too much detail, what we really find is that despite the fast growth of their businesses, their performance actually still lag behind that of other or general businesses and white-owned businesses. Because you can see, if we just look at 2007 across the board, all businesses, their sales and receipts is about 463,000. whereas it is 66 for Black-owned businesses, 303 for Asian-owned businesses, and 171,000 for Hispanic-owned businesses. So their business scales are still relatively small, and the same kind of pattern apply to the other indicators, including the number of workers, as well as the total payroll.
Sorry to interrupt, Cathy. Would you be able to wrap up quickly?
Yes, yeah. Not going to show you the regression tables, but very quickly, the regression results are that we found the growth of minority-owned firms was positively related to the existing concentration of their respective populations, but not significantly related to the growth of these populations. We found some that Hispanic firms grow faster in areas with higher income. We also find some interesting dynamics of how their growth are related to the share of different industries in different areas. But the results on their response to local fiscal policy, which we have things like government expenditure, property tax, differ across groups with mixed results, and I'm not going to share that right now. So in conclusion, we do find that minority-owned businesses have very strong presence in the suburbs, that they actually grow faster in the central counties. They hire about 20 to 23% of total central area workforce, but about 15 to 17% of suburban workforce during this time. One interesting finding, we find that Black-owned businesses are the least suburbanized of all the groups that we have examined, despite the fast suburbanizing trend of the Black residents. However, the business scale remains small and lag behind the kind of the general or other white-owned businesses. We certainly find that despite this is a different context, the importance of co-ethnic population in the communities for the growth of their respective businesses. There's some interesting policy implications. Again, there will be interesting case studies that can really complement this to show what's going on in each of the MSAs. But what we find is that how do these new spatial dynamics of the businesses match with the existing resources that's available in different communities, and are we really catering to their different needs and preferences? Very quickly, the limitation is certainly that we wish we have newer data, but there's a lag of when the data is available and what analysis we can do. But we're trying to use the newly available 2017 data to kind of maybe trace these trends over to a newer time. So I'll just stop here and really look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cathy. This is fascinating. And I think the real interesting findings and really insightful, I'm really looking forward to the discussions. I have already seen the questions in the chat box. And for the audience, please feel free to ask your questions directed to Dr. Liu later on. We'll have this Q&A section at the end of the presentation. Please write your questions in the chat box. Thank you so much, Cathy. Now I'm turning it over to our next speaker, Dr. Jie Shen. Jie, the floor is yours. Thank you.
So hello again from Shanghai. I just want to first thank Anna, Zhixi, and all the organizers for organizing this very interesting session on suburban migration. And I'm also very glad to have this opportunity to present one of my research on socio-spatial exclusion of migrants in Shanghai. Just a very brief introduction to the research background. background. As you may know, that China had witnessed rapid urbanization in the past few decades, which is thusly driven by large-scale rural to urban migration. Actually, the influx of migrants into Chinese cities had increased from 155 million in 2010 to 376 million last year. This group, however, is usually known as floating population because for those migrants, they are not entitled the same legal rights as urban permanent residents. Moreover, when they move to cities, most migrants, they tend to concentrate in the urban periphery instead of central areas, because only in the suburbs they could find cheap residence. So the three dominant residential forms of migrants in the suburbs in China include, for example, factory dormitories, urban villages, as well as co-renting in high-rent apartments. So far, there is already a large body of literature on rural to urban migration in China. However, very little attention has been paid to the role of migrants' residential location in their integration into the cities. This issue, however, has become increasingly important because in Chinese cities, recent massive demolition of urban villages, i.e. those migrant enclaves in the inner suburban areas, has actually pushed them farther away. So against this background, this research aims to empirically examine whether migrants' marginal position in a whole society would be further reinforced by the constrained life chance on the urban periphery. While not denying the positive role of suburbs in the supply of low-cost housing for migrants, I like to demonstrate or argue that actually in the long run, disadvantaged peripheral locations may actually further limit the life chance of migrants in Chinese cities. Actually, there has long been a concern on the social impacts of suburban residential location for migrants or immigrants. As you might already quite familiar that, for example, in many Western cities, particularly in the United States, suburbanization has been recognized as a key step in the process of structural assimilation for immigrants. For example, according to the social-spatial assimilation theory, for those immigrants arrived like in the early 20th century, although initially they tended to reside in those ethnic enclaves in older city centers, but alongside the acculturation into the society, as well as the accumulation of economic resources, these immigrants always tend to move out of their initial ethnic enclaves in the inner city to better quality middle-class suburbia to achieve so-called spatial assimilation. This model, however, has been greatly challenged by other models since 1990s. For example, Logan and Abbott developed an alternative model known as place stratification. According to this model, because structural discrimination institutions persist, actually for many immigrant minority groups, it was quite difficult actually for them to translate their individual level achievement, such as human capital, into upward residential mobility. As a result, even when these immigrants moved to the suburbs, they could only sort themselves into suburban communities with lower social status. However, suburban experience of migrants in the global south are not follow the uniform pattern found in the global north. For example, for the case of China, I here propose this model of spatial entrapment of migrants in the suburbs in Chinese cities. Initially, when these rural migrants move to cities, they always tend to reside in suburban migrant enclaves for social support. However, in the Chinese case, most jobs in the suburbs are in manufacturing and hence could only provide poor pay and prospects. Moreover, migrants in the suburbs also have fewer community resources and have very limited accessibility to public services and public facilities. Moreover, living in those isolated migrant enclaves in the suburbs could also limit migrants' exposure to native residents and therefore limit their opportunities to build local social networks and social capital. As a result, these migrants could have less chance to materialize upward social mobility, but instead trapped in the suburban locations. I use the case of Shanghai to explore the research question. Actually, the city had experienced dramatic suburbanization in the past 2 decades. However, as you can easily note from these 2 maps, it is the influx of rural to urban migrants had contributed greatly to such rapid suburban growth of Shanghai. The location quotient analysis indicated that actually most migrants are concentrated in suburban districts. In particular, for some districts like Jiading, Qingpu, and Songjiang, they now have even more migrant population than local natives. On the contrary, the central areas remain dominated by local residents, which accounted to more than 75% of the total population in the central area. So the empirical analysis is based on the questionnaire survey distributed across the city in the year 2013. The survey adopted a multi-stage cluster sampling method. It generated a random sample of 1,420 households, among which there were 295 migrant respondents. So quantitatively, this study examined the integration of migrants in both economic and social terms. In economic terms, we know that economic integration represents a key element of a successful migration. And this was examined, this was measured by locked family income of the migrant households. In terms of social integration, it is measured by the migrants' local social network, i.e. if the migrants' most friends are local Shanghainese or local natives. The residential location of the migrants is simply coded as indicator variable to examine the differences between migrants in the central city and migrants in the suburban areas. Besides individual attributes such as age, gender, marriage status, or length of residence, as well as institutional variables, including both hukou location and hukou classification, are used as control variables to control for other mechanisms that might have impacts on migrants' socioeconomic integration in the city. So let's have a look at the readouts for place effects of migrants' integration in Shanghai. This is the regression readouts for economic integration of migrants in Shanghai. As expected, it is confirmed that many individual level attributes have significant impacts on migrants' earning, including like gender, university degree, occupation, as well as length of residence in Shanghai. But after controlling for these mechanisms, the living in the suburbs is found to have a negative impacts on migrants' earning for migrants on average living in the suburbs those migrants living in the suburbs actually earn about 18% less than those living in the central cities. So this is the regression results for social integration of migrants. And as expected, we found that age, university degree, as well as length of residence could increase the likelihood of migrants to build local social networks with native residents. Besides, we found that migrants holding urban hukou is more likely to adapt to the urban life in Shanghai. And after controlling all these mechanisms, the residential location is again found to have negatively impacts on migrants' social integration, i.e. for those migrants living in the suburbs, they have much less chance to build locally based social networks or local social capital. In order to test the spatial entrapment of migrants in Shanghai, the residential mobility of those migrants was further examined. The results indicate that as already found in many other existing studies, these migrants in Shanghai also show very high level of residential mobility. So around 49% of the migrants reported that they have moved at least once in the past 3 years. Moreover, for those who had never moved, about 70% of them lived in suburbs, confirming that suburbs are usually their initial residential location in Shanghai. So this table just presents the results of regression analysis testing the independent effects of previous residential location on migrant subsequent residential location. It is indicated that for those who have moved in the past 3 decades, married migrants are more likely to move into the city center. Meanwhile, getting a local hukou as well as earning more money could also increase their likelihood to move into more advantaged locations in the city center. After controlling for all these effects, the previous residential location is found to have played an important role in migrants' subsequent residential location, because for those migrants initially live in the suburbs, they actually have much less chance to move into the city center. So just a very brief conclusion. This study just empirically demonstrated that place matters, i.e. for migrants in Shanghai, they may be spatially marginalized in disadvantaged suburban locations due to lack of good opportunities, lack of limited access to public facilities, as well as living in isolated neighborhoods. So this study also have broader policy implications, as I just mentioned, because recent massive demolition of inner suburban urban villages have actually pushed those migrants farther away and may displace and exclude them more from the host society. Therefore, besides a lot of institutional adjustments, such as the relaxing of hukou, I think it is also important to improve the provision of public services in those suburban migrant communities to improve migrants' social integration in the host city. So that's all for my presentation, and very look forward for your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jie. I found it fascinating. It's really insightful to look at the suburbs in China, and which is quite different from the spatial patterns and historical development context here in North America. And I really look forward to more discussions after the next presentation. So next one, last but not least, and our speaker, Professor Carlos Teixeira. Over to you, Carlos.
Good morning. First of all, my land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that University of British Columbia Okanagan is situated in the territory of the Silks Okanagan Nation and their peoples. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. This being said, I would like to thank the organizers for this event. In fact, we are in touch with the world. Too bad we are not in Toronto. I am missing my city, Toronto, one of the most multicultural cities in this country, but we have this other solution to be in touch with people from all over the world. So welcome aboard. Before I start my presentation, I would like to let you know, because we have people from all over the world, never traveled to Canada and so on, I would like to put things in context. In Canada, we have only 37 million people, 37 million according to the last census that was published last week. And I want to go back to stats, a few words about stats, highlights about Stats Canada, and then I will move to my presentation. In terms of highlights coming from the last census, I would like to let you know that one thing that has not changed from 5 years ago, census 2016 and now census 2021, is that Canada remains the growing country in the G7. Most of that growth is due to more people arriving here from around the world to start a new life. Approximately 1.8 million more people were calling home in 2021 compared with 5 years ago, with 4 in 5 of this having immigrated to Canada since 2016. Another highlight from this stat, and I'm not surprised, immigration, not fertility, mostly drove Canada's population growth. Another highlight, in 2021, nearly 3 in 4 Canadians, or approximately 74%, lived in one of Canada's large urban centers. Point one. Point two, Canada continues to urbanize as large urban centers benefit most from new arrivals to the country. From 2016 to 2019, Canada welcomed the record high number of immigrants, and more than 9 in 10 settled in what we call here in Canada census metropolitan areas. Last but not least, from Stats Canada, at the same time, urban space continued and was accelerating in many census metropolitan areas. Overall, suburbs, farthest from downtowns, were generally growing at a faster pace, close to 9%, than the urban fringe, 4%, and suburbs closer to downtown, 6%. In sum, we are becoming, Canada is becoming more and more a suburban country. So this being said, I think it's quite appropriate because we are talking about suburbanization here. I think these highlights put things in context. And if you are interested, please look at Stats Canada. We have very interesting data dealing with population. Now I am moving to my presentation, and I will be focusing on housing new Canadians on the edge of the suburbs of Vancouver, a case study of the settlement and housing experiences of immigrant renters in 4 suburbs of Vancouver: Burnaby, an old suburb; Surrey, Richmond, and Abbotsford, new suburbs. Next slide, please. I would like to start to let you know that the successful integration of immigrants into a new society is based on their attainment of several basic needs, of which one of the most important is access to adequate, suitable, and affordable housing in a welcoming community, certainly. Next slide. Access to affordable and adequate housing has long been a concern in cities such as Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, two major port of entries for new immigrants and refugees. 75% or so, 2/3 of all immigrants arriving in Canada, they don't go to rural areas or to small and mid-sized cities. Some go, but the large majority, that's my point, they go to what we call the MTV, Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. The question is, in fact, most of the studies dealing with immigrants in Canada, they focus on these three major cities. I remember when I was a PhD student in Toronto in the mid-80s, I think I was one of the first geographers looking at the suburbanization of immigrants. I looked at the suburbanization of immigrants and I had a control group of Canadians moving to Mississauga at the time, mid-60s. If you go to my PhD dissertation, how many studies did we have at the time looking at the suburbs? I am so glad to see that now more and more in Canada, we are looking at this, at the suburbs, at the role and impact immigrants have in the suburbs, at the barriers and challenges they face in the suburbs. Which brings me here to the next point of my slide, which is, it's also an increasing issue more and more in the suburbs of Canadian cities, the issue of lack of affordable housing, as well as the fact that immigrant settlement services is quite limited in our suburbs, not to talk about public transportation and other barriers and challenges that our immigrants face in the suburbs of today. So within this context, lack of studies, etc., I think Burnaby, an old suburb of Vancouver, and Surrey, Richmond, and Abbotsford, new suburbs of Vancouver, are good study areas. Next slide, please. My paper will focus in immigrant renters settlement experiences, including their access to local services and their housing experiences and outcomes in those suburbs of Toronto. I had several key questions guiding my study. One was, what are the socio-demographic profile of these immigrants? Does available housing matter in their decision to locate in the suburbs? What about housing services to help these immigrants integrate in the suburbs of Canadian cities? Next slide. And the other four questions were related to their current housing situation and what various challenges they faced in locating and obtaining affordable, adequate, and suitable housing in a welcoming neighborhood. Does ethnic background, race, language, income, source of income matters? Another key question was, are immigrants at risk of hidden homelessness in the suburbs? What strategies are they using to cope with these barriers? Do their housing conditions change over time? Question 6, what integrative role, if any, does a welcoming community play in the successful inclusion of immigrants in the suburbs? What do we know now about the integration of immigrants in our suburbs? And last but not least, what policy changes are recommended to deal with these barriers and these challenges that immigrants face? Next slide, please. We have here a map showing immigrants as a percentage of the total population in Vancouver. You can see that the suburbs, Vancouver is a beautiful city, one of the most beautiful cities in Canada, and I would say in the world, with very high housing prices. Less and less immigrants can live in Vancouver, and they are expanding more and more to other municipalities like Burnaby, Richmond, Surrey, Langley, etc., even Abbotsford, and they are going to the Fraser Valley. This is what will happen in the future as this suburbanization more and more towards east of Vancouver, mainly in search of affordable housing. Next slide. In terms of data collection, the data I will be presenting here today comes from two major studies. One I did in the summer of 2010. I did informal interviews with key informants, 7 focus groups, I got 111 recent immigrants. Recent immigrants within the context of this study are immigrants that arrived in Canada in the last 10 years. Census Canada used 5 years as recent immigrants. I use 10 years. Out of this 111, 88 were renters, 23 were homeowners. Also in the spring of 2019, with Annabelle Salinas, we did another study in the suburbs of Vancouver. We did 60 key informant interviews. We had this time questionnaire surveys, 129 recent immigrants, the same time period, 10 years. We got 88 renters. I will not talk about homeowners in this study. I will be talking about recent immigrants, immigrant renters. Next slide, please. I will not have time to go through all the main key themes or questions that were raised throughout the study. Next question, please. Next slide. In 2 or 3 words, we had immigrants from all over the world with high levels of education. More and more we find immigrants arriving in Canada with university degrees, but unfortunately they finish by not having jobs that correlate or corresponds to their levels of education and good knowledge of the English language. Next slide, please. Most of these immigrants, when they arrived in Canada, they lived with friends, with relatives. Settlement services played a minor role in helping these immigrants finding housing, as well as little support from the government finding housing and jobs on arrival. The first year was the most difficult for these newcomers. Next slide, please. Sharing accommodation with relatives is a common strategy used by relatives that are by friends and relatives from the same country, who speak the same language, from the same culture. There are advantages and disadvantages, certainly, but it eases the arrival, the first few months of these immigrants in the new country. Next slide, please. In terms of housing experiences, the rental housing market, it's not easy for these people to find affordable housing. In fact, a high percentage of respondents spend 30% or more of their income on shelter. In fact, 40% spend 30 to 50%, and 45% spend more than 50%. According to CMHC, if you spend more than 30% of your monthly income in housing, you are in core housing need. If you spend more than 50%, you are at risk of homelessness. Next slide, please. In terms of housing trajectory, it's quite interesting. They start by sharing accommodation with friends and relatives. Then some move to basement apartments to save money on rents. Then they rent an apartment, and the ultimate goal for all of these people, I can guarantee you, is to own a house one day. In terms of reasons for moving to the present residence, the respondents indicated housing costs, rents too expensive, the quality of housing and the housing conditions were also important reasons for moving in the suburbs. In terms of voluntary versus involuntary forced moves, I found that 24% of these renters, they were forced to move. They were evicted. The landlords increased their rents to a level that they could not afford. They had no choice, they had to move. Next slide. In terms of housing search, they relied extensively on relatives and friends to locate their present house. But I found in the last 10, 15 years, and I was not surprised here, that more and more immigrants, they rely on social media, internet, et cetera, to find their house. Again, important to underline that with regard to housing, very few of these respondents received assistance from government or non-government organizations. Overall, the search process, they found it very difficult, I would say stressful, in large part because of their low incomes compared to high rents, the housing costs, the type and size of housing. Usually immigrants want larger houses, more rooms, the location vis-a-vis public transportation, jobs, as well as lack of in-depth and reliable housing information about the local rental markets in the suburbs. Next slide, please. They are presently living in apartments with less than 4 stories, and basement apartments are quite popular in the suburbs. If they are legalized, that's great. The problem is we have a lot of illegal renting. That's another story we can talk later on. In terms of residential satisfaction, 41% are satisfied with their current dwelling with regard to size, quality, etc. And 45% are also satisfied with regard to their current neighborhood. One of the last questions I had, future moves, their plans, and most of these people, most of these immigrants, they came to Canada to stay, and most want to become home owners in Canada one day. I have 2 minutes to go. Can I go please to the last slide if I am correct? I have a series of recommendations as well as areas for future research. I hope I will have the opportunity to discuss with you some of the recommendations I got from the key informants and from the immigrants with regard to important issues like lack of affordable housing, issues of housing discrimination, as well as lack of housing information to locate affordable, adequate, and suitable housing in the suburbs of Vancouver. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Fascinating. Another insightful presentation. I really appreciate all these presentations, and also appreciate the very engaging audience here. We have received lots of questions, and I will first take the first round of questions directed to Cathy and Jie and Carlos specifically, and then we'll ask some of the general questions for all the speakers to comment on. But first thing first, thank you, Cathy. I think you have already answer many of the questions briefly. I think one of the most one of the main questions from the audience is about the differences between central cities and the suburbs. And people ask you about, for example, the cultural context or historical context, or the data sources in terms of ethnic origin or country of origin, or income, etc., and also business type. You have answered those questions, but I will ask you if you have any other observations you would like to share with the audience in terms of these comparisons between the central cities and the suburbs.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been slowly trying to answer the questions, but it just has been really slow because I was also trying to pay attention to the other presentations. Yes, you're right. I think some of the questions really converge on this issue of data and how much detail can be provided. And as I mentioned, I really wish that we can, we have more richer and detailed data that we can separate out a lot of the nuances, right? I mean, that nuance both pertain to the businesses themselves, because lumping together all the different groups of business owners, we're probably just over grouping them because there are just so many different dynamics going on. And at the same time, at the contextual level for the population groups in different areas, we're using fairly aggregated information variables to capture those kind of population diversity, to capture their migration path, the cultural differences, and all of that. And let me explain why that is the case, because the whole idea here is to have a bigger picture. Thus, I use the Survey of Business Owners data. This data, despite it have the business owner information, that's kind of what I'm using. What we're using is as much detail as we could get. So there's no way we can actually break it further down into the specific groups beyond these kind of really broad categories of business owned, Black owned, Asian owned, and Hispanic owned. We just cannot get down into anything like their national origin. And even the newer versions of this data do not have even this kind of detail on the business owners. I use this data still to take advantage of the business indicators and business level variables that we can get to really look at their business scale, their economic impact. But the more detailed data might be coming from the population census, which I have also used, right? That we can really get to the owner's national origin and all of that. But the problem is in the population data, we have to use self-employment as a proxy for businesses, and we don't have any information on the business indicators. So it is certainly something that's kind of a difficult choice. So this research really stays at a fairly kind of a broad level, and even I cannot tease out way I was asking, kind of looking at industry and business owner together, because it's just not. It's not a micro data, it's aggregate data. There was only 1 year, 2007, that a micro data was provided, and that was the data actually used to be able to tease out immigrant-owned businesses by themselves. But even the following data sets, that's not even available anymore. So there are some constraints by the data, but I also think many people raise some really good points about maybe some different ways, for example, looking at policies, looking at kind of regional differences and things like that. I'm still reading through them. Thank you.
Absolutely. It could be a big challenge in terms of how we, as researchers, and how do we access data, and also how do race, class, ethnicity, gender, or other forms of diversity play out in shaping immigrants' lived experiences and their socio-economic integration outcomes in this suburban context. And there's so much more we can further explore. Absolutely agree. This is really a challenging piece when it comes to looking at individual cities and their context and the specific issues there. The next question for Jie. I think a couple of questions here from Anna, from Ngozi, asking about this kind of like the population in the Chinese cities or the Chinese suburbs. You answered Anna's question about their access to services or their local rights to services, and how does that compare with inner city, and you talk about the bus routes. Then Ngozi asked you about the topology from your study, from that hukou perspective. Have you thought about would this make any sense if you add this in the regression analysis?
Right. Actually, for Ngosi's suggestion, actually, we only have two ways of hukou classification here in China. One is based on hukou location, which refers to where you are registered locally. For example, for those migrants, most of their hukou location was in their hometown, so they do not have local hukou. As a result, they do not have rights to apply for like public schools or public housing in host cities. And another way of hukou classification here in China is based on the settlement of your hukou registration, the type of settlement of your hukou registration. For example, if you are born in rural areas, then you are registered as rural hukou. But if you are born in cities, your hukou would be classified as urban hukou. So we do not. It seems like it is not very. It does not have not sensible to add like central hukou or suburban hukou. It's like that.
Thank you, Jie. Another question from the audience is about similar immigration patterns happen in the US. For example, poorer or lower skilled immigrants move to suburbs and entrapped there in terms of housing, jobs, and transportation and services, etc. So they are asking you if you have any comments or comparisons in this situation to possibly apply your conceptual framework beyond the Chinese cities.
Thank you very much. Very good points. I think actually I would be very interested in compare the situation of suburban migrants or suburban immigrants in the Chinese or the United States context, because for my own research, because in the case of China, suburbs are not the ideal residential location in Chinese cities. For example, the housing price is much higher in the central areas than the suburbs, because the suburbs are usually lack of good job opportunities or quality schools or etc. So so people preferred, or the people with higher socioeconomic state, they prefer to living in central areas. That is why those rural migrants have been excluded in the suburban areas where they could find cheap houses. So I'm just thinking this might be a little bit different from the idea of suburban communities in United States or in North America, because it seems like those suburban communities are better off middle-class families. So it seems like the spatial context or the social geography of cities are not exactly the same.
Thank you, Jie. I think that goes to the next question, but I will ask Carlos some questions first before I jump to another question which is really relevant to the questions you just answered about the Chinese cities and suburbanization here, there in China, but also in Europe. There are a couple of comments related to cities in Europe and specifically in Germany, and the patterns are not the same. And we must acknowledge that suburbs take many forms based on the local context. And we'll get to that comment. But let me ask Carlos first. We do have a couple of questions about from Amin. Have you examined the relationship between housing and house? For example, the physical characteristics of houses for migrants. How does this relationship explain settlement choices in the suburbs?
Yeah, this is a very good question, but I have not paid attention to this issue. Once I thought to look, well, indirectly, I have looked at the importance of basements in a house, the second kitchen, because some immigrant groups pay a lot of attention to issues like having an extra kitchen or having a basement, etc. I found that in my studies that some immigrant groups, particularly Southern immigrant groups and some Latin American groups, they pay attention to that. But I have not looked at the other dimension. But we have some studies done in Canada, looking at this issue. So please send me an email, carlos.teixeira@gbc.ca. I can forward to you some of those publications looking at housing in the suburbs, from the mega houses to different types of styles, etc. We have, in my opinion, a richer literature dealing with that component or dimension in US than we have in Canada. But I can forward to you some of those publications if you're interested.
Thank you, Carlos. Maybe you can also address Wei Li's question about the comparison between older and newer suburbs and our older and newer immigrant groups. Do you see differences?
Yeah, thanks, Wei, a good friend from US. So always good questions. Wei, as you know, the move to the suburbs in the case of Canada started a little bit later than in the United States, okay? We have, since I arrived in Canada at the end of the 70s, I still studied first cohort of first generation immigrants in Toronto, but now I am looking and studying more and more a new generation of immigrants, which are highly educated, they have a good knowledge of the English language, in contrast to a first generation I studied before that went to the suburbs. They were mainly blue collars. They survived, they did well, they worked hard, and the ultimate dream was to go to the suburbs. So we have two groups based in my 40 years, almost 40 years searching and looking at the suburbanization of immigrants. Yes, I see differences to answer your question. The ones who arrived in the 60s, 70s versus the ones who are arriving today. That's my first answer. That's my answer to your question. However, it's interesting to underline that I find that these new generations, despite their levels of education, the fact they have a good knowledge of the English language, etc., they are struggling more. In my opinion, they are struggling more than the first generation, not only to find affordable housing to rent, but also to buy. Okay, the question of the Canadian dream, if I can use the Canadian dream to become a homeowner, I found in the last 15 years is becoming more and more difficult for this quote unquote new generation of immigrants that I arrived in the last 20, 25 years, that the generation way that that is or are bypassing the inner city. As you know, the first generations, they arrived, they stayed in the core of major Canadian cities, the port of entries. They start by renting. They bought quite often housing of poor quality. They made some renovations, and then they quote unquote graduated, moving to the suburbs. So now it's a different group of immigrants. They are bypassing the inner cities and they are moving directly to the suburbs. Who can afford a house in Vancouver? If I find one, and we have how many people here, 143. If I have somebody with an answer, I pay you a trip to my beautiful islands in the Azores, where I was born. Who can afford? What can you rent for $2,000 in Vancouver? You will rent a basement for $1,500, et cetera, et cetera. The situation is not also very good in Toronto, okay? And the problem is going further away to small and mid-sized cities. I live in the city of Kelowna. UBC campus is in the city of Kelowna, in the interior of British Columbia, in the beautiful Okanagan Valley, and I am living in the 4th or the 5th most expensive real estate market in Canada. Location, location, location matters here.
Okay, thank you. I know we may not be able to address more questions specifically about each one of your presentation or your studies, but we do have a couple of general questions I would like to address to all the panelists and see if you could comment on that. And thanks to Claudia and Doug and Ngozi, you all talk about you don't see the significant tendency of suburbanization, for example, in Germany, but also there are some exceptions. For example, like the mass refugee resettlement in the peripheral, peripheries with the mass housing apartment districts, for example. So how do you see that, like the different forms of suburbanization? And would that be, like in your theoretical framework, would that be any implications for the other contexts or in other continents? And also, like, what can we do about these different trajectories of suburbanization and immigrant settlement? Would you be able to comment a bit more on this diversity of suburban forms? Maybe we go through the order again. Cathy?
Sure. Yeah, I was actually typing an answer along those lines. I think the more I hear about this panel and seeing all the questions, the more I feel like there will be a lot of value in looking at this phenomenon across different contexts in different countries, different cities. Because even in the US, where we used to have this stereotype or dichotomy of, richer suburbs or poorer central cities for some time, or as I mentioned earlier, right, white suburbs and more diverse central cities. I mean, that kind of a stereotype or dichotomy also doesn't exist in all cases. And we do have the move back to the cities movement these days, that actually higher income residents move back to the cities and actually crowding out or gentrifying many of the neighborhoods where, used to be more kind of a diverse and have many minority population. And then some of that, the minority residents actually move to the suburbs. So there are really a lot of different directions and different trajectories of change that any kind of a single theorizing of a pattern would be problematic. So I think, to me, a question here is that, well, sometimes for research purposes, that we have to make this dichotomy, we need to understand those different kind of situations and variations exist not only across different countries, but even within a country, we do have a lot of these variations as well. But to me, the bigger question also, even to look at this, and didn't get to talk about this in the policy implication, is that, are we saying that suburban location is better than central city location when we talk about residential choice? And similarly, are we saying suburban location are better than central city location when we talk about business location choices? I mean, we do have some research evidence showing that businesses operating in different markets, right? The more mainstream markets versus a very niche targeted markets, they might have different path and trajectory of success. So if there are barriers that exist that prevent certain groups from entering certain markets, similar to what used to be with the residential location, right? That certain groups might have certain constraints and limitations with residential choices, then these are the barriers, and these are the situations that we really need to examine and understand, so that this can be, we do open all these different choices to the different types of businesses, no matter what their business strategy and success strategy may be. So I think that is a big question. And also that's why I feel it's interesting that we do see that Hispanic and Asian-owned businesses seems to suburbanize, even though to a not at the same pace as their respective population. But we do still see that the Black population do suburbanize to the suburbs, but not so much for their businesses. And there might be a lot of different dynamics in there, right? That, are there certain attractiveness in the central city locations, or is it barriers to the suburban markets? So I think there are just, we're really looking at kind of the trends here, but there are a lot of things that's going on beneath it.
Thank you, Cathy. Jie, any comments?
Yes, thank you, Zhixi, for your question. I think your question is also related to Dr. Wei Li's question in the chat box, because I was just typing the answer to Dr. Li, but I will explain this here, because she mentioned that in terms of explaining the diversity of suburbs, it might be useful to refer to Stephen Castle's call for middle theory that can be applied in different contexts, but not grand theory that is universally applicable. I think this is very useful comment for understanding the diverse suburban forms. I think, but it's very important if we like to compare those different suburban forms across the world. It might be very important actually to look at both those universal as well as those particular forces shaping suburban spaces, as well as the diverse implications of those of these locations for migrants. In the meantime, I also think it would be quite relatively difficult actually, or not very easy actually to achieve this goal, because actually currently many of the existing theories on suburbanization or suburbs is based on Western urban experience. So we still need to further investigate the situations in maybe suburbanization in global south, so as to rethink the classic theories on suburbanization and urbanization, etc. So thank you.
Thank you, Jie. Thank you, Carlos. Any other comments?
Well, just to add, I was looking at the comments, and probably it's related to this initial question: is the future of cities the future of our suburbs? For our colleagues who are in other countries, I recommend you look at the Globe and Mail. They published this. Globe and Mail is the national newspaper. They published a good number of articles dedicated to the impact of COVID-19 upon our cities. And I just have one here: the future of cities, urban disturbance. I will read. COVID-19 has sparked dramatic outmigration from cities, pending long-held demand for high-density buildings, and the forces driving these changes may linger for years to come. So what we are seeing is, what is the future of our cities? We are seeing urban exodus that started now more. Because of COVID-19, we have more and more people moving to further and further away to the periphery of the suburbs. The question is where the suburbs start and where the suburbs end. So it's becoming more and more blurry, the boundaries separating the suburbs. Then we have old suburbs, then we have new suburbs, then we have the exurbs on the periphery of the new suburbs. The way I see things with regard to immigrants, which is my study population, we will see less and less immigrants coming to the three most important cities in Canada, the port of entry, Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. Gentrification is there since the end of the 70s. It's displacing low-income people. Immigrants have less and less the power, the possibility to build those institutional complete communities that we know for decades that existed in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, Chinatown, Little Portugal, Little Italy, Little Poland, etc., etc. Those immigrants don't have anymore this capacity because the real estate is extremely expensive. Gentrification is there, continues displacing those immigrants. So the new immigrants that are coming and will continue coming, they will go to the suburbs, and they will go further and further away in the suburbs. And they will pay a price for that, in terms of transportation, in terms of accessibility to jobs, in terms of services. We have great people working in local organizations, but we need to invest more in terms of services to help those immigrants with issues of language, jobs, finding housing, in order to help them to integrate into the tapestry of our more and more complex suburbs.
Thank you, Carlos. I would just want to echo what Wei Li just commented on Jie's emphasis on the global south-based studies. And definitely, if we want to talk about suburbanization, if we want to apply these global perspectives to the suburbs, there are many forms, there are many place-based approaches we must consider, and the people there, right? Who are those people we are studying? Refugees, newcomers, illegal immigrants, long-time immigrants, etc. And also think about their race and ethnic origins and their cultural background, etc., etc. So we always, like, as academics, practitioners, and policymakers, we must really consider who are the key players we should engage in order to improve the status quo. And also, what are the systemic barriers that prevent us from creating welcoming, inclusive communities to support migrant settlement and integration, whether or not in the cities or in the suburbs? And also, what are the policy implications? How can we actually change and challenge the status quo? So I'm mindful of the time. I really would like to thank our wonderful speakers again. Big applause to Dr. Liu, Dr. Shen and Dr. Teixeira. And thank you for your insightful contributions to this discussion. And also I'm really grateful for the active participation of our audience. And unfortunately, my apologies, I was not able to go through all the questions and address your questions, although our conference has to end, but I'm sure these conversations will continue. I'm really looking forward to meeting with some of you in the future, somewhere in the world, to continue these conversations. Before we end the conference, I'm going to turn it over to Anna to give the closing remarks. Thank you, everyone. Over to you, Anna. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, just very briefly to thank you, of course, today's panel. It was a very lively discussion and the chat was going like on fire. This gives me the opportunity. Well, first of all, I want to thank Zhuxi, Amin, Melissa, and Zainab, who are the architects of this conference together with me. And they have, not only moderated the panels, but also helped come up with the speakers and the topics, etc. To let you know that all registered participants will receive a message shortly with the videos of like all the sessions are recorded, and also with the PowerPoints. We will check now that the conference is finished, and we will check with all the speakers whether they're comfortable sharing their PowerPoint, the final versions, etc. So just bear with us for a couple of days. On that, like finishing with these thanks and practical questions for those that may have those questions. We know that the sessions were not accessible for everyone in all time zones. That's the ultimate frontier of this, online world. But on this, I'd like to make a few reflections about what we have discussed these 3-4 days. And I think it was our actually explicit objective to look at issues like today and yesterday in the afternoon session of the interaction between migrants, their entrepreneurship, their strategies for settlement and integration or for further mobility, and policies at the local level, at the city level, and also sometimes how these interact with the policies at the national level. And I think it is interesting that the discussion today with respect to that of yesterday afternoon is almost juxtaposed, because we were saying how people go to suburbs and how these are transforming, and also that sometimes people bypass the city center. And yesterday we were talking about the small and mid-sized cities and the challenges that they face. And I know Jus and myself have also interacted on the idea that maybe, Carlos, you were hinting to that sometimes you cannot say where the suburb is finishing and where the small or mid-sized town is starting in some areas that are peri-urbanized. Like, for instance, yes, this belt of Canada alongside the US border. And I think the same can be said for different regions in different countries in the world. Now, we also looked at one particular way in how cities are transforming from below, and that was through cities that are gateways for refugees, and where there is an intense activity also of civil society, and of course all the problems actually there of control, detention, irregularity, precarious status. And in the first 2 sessions, we had the more cultural approach, looking at how people transform their cities from below, and how they live this diversity in the urban context, but also how actually cities try to govern diversity, and even if you want, use it to project themselves to the world. I was delighted that in all sessions, of course it was by design, but I was delighted that in the end it was possible to have cases like today, like spanning 2 parts of the globe, like China and North America, but also in the other sessions, bringing together cases from Africa, actually from Southern and West Africa, with cases from the Middle East and West Asia, with Europe, North America, and even South America. So I think that shows that there is something that unites us all in terms of migration and urbanization, and we look forward to carry this discussion further. And finally, a big thanks to our audience for sticking with us in these different sessions and for a wonderful chat. Many things I've learned through this chat. Thank you all again, and have a good night, good afternoon, and good morning.